Okay, well today is April 24, 2023. My name is Tony Venhuizen. We are here recording an oral history interview for the South Dakota State Historical Society. And you, I think, are Frank Brost, but I'm going to ask you to give your name and spell it for us as your first question.
Okay, I think I can handle that. Frank Brost, B-R-O-S-T.
Frank Brost, all right. And you've given permission to record this interview?
I have.
All right. We're going to start out talking a little bit about your life, Frank, and your background. Can you tell us when and where you were born and kind of where you grew up?
Well, I was born in Alliance, Nebraska on March 8, 1937, about 5 o'clock in the morning, as I understand it. My parents were Herman and Mabel Brost. They were farm kids from the Alliance area. But at the time, they were on some leased Indian land up by Wambalee running their sheep. And they had trailed a bunch of sheep from Gordon, Nebraska up there in about 1931 or 2. And because there was no medical facilities and my mother had worked the hospital there, they had taken me down, or she and me to be, down to live with their sister until I was born.
And then you grew up?
Well, at the time, they had, that spring, they had just been, their lease had been terminated, all sheep on the reservation, so they had trailed them over to Jones County, south of Okoton on the White River, and they had leased that land. So I grew up in Jones County on a sheep ranch and went to school all 12 years in Murdo. And at a point in time, they bought a house in Murdo, so my sister and I could go to school in there. And then my parents were building. They didn't buy, they built a ranch, so a sheep ranch. I grew up on a sheep ranch until the 60s when it was converted to a cattle ranch.
So being in Murdo, you must have crossed paths with the Thunes?
I did. We had a home in the same block that Harold and Pat raised their family in, but earlier than that, like I said, my parents were in the sheep business, so they, and Dad had a good-sized flock of sheep, and he did a lot of business with Nick Thune, Harold's dad, because we bought a lot of supplies from a great man. He bought me my father was not athletic, but Nick was. So Nick bought me my first baseball glove, or ordered it.
Huh.
And I played infield, so he had short fingers and not long fingers. He was a great man, loved him dearly.
So did you grow up in Murdo or out on the ranch?
Both those things, yeah. You know, I went to school in Murdo during the wintertime, but primarily I was on the ranch. That's what my parents' livelihood was, and, you know.
And that was south of Murdo?
It was south of Okoton primarily, yeah, down on the White River.
Okay, so your first job, I suppose, was working on the ranch.
First job was trailing sheep and helping suckle bum lambs and do all the nasty little things helping raise sheep.
So talking about your education then, when you finished high school, did you go on to college right away, or where did you go next?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I graduated. I was a good student in high school and a good high school athlete. I was recruited to play basketball down at the university. I went down the fall of '55 and graduated in '59.
Were pretty good teams in those years, weren't they?
They had better teams than my skill set, and yeah, I was a semester behind the two Daniels boys from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Brought a national championship to USD, and
You were on that team?
no, well, I played with them into my sophomore year,
Okay.
but there was no way I was going to play any basketball behind those two. I was recruited along with another All-State kid, Harley Zephyr, who had played in Mission, and he showed up down there and made the same decision. He left and went on to Yankton and had a great career at Yankton College. But they played at a higher level, evidenced by the fact that they won a national championship.
Who was the coach?
Claude Felder.
That's right. Yeah, Claude Felder. So down at USD, you went down for basketball. What did you major in?
Well, I passed up a full-ride scholarship to go to South Dakota State, play football and basketball.
Oh.
But I asked Coach, again, wonderful man, what I could major in, state, and he said engineering and pharmacy, and I said I don't want to major in either one of those. I was interested in business, and that's why I went to USD, and they had a great business school, and that was the attraction academically.
So you graduated in
June of 1959. From the B School, and then I was commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Army
Okay.
Reserves and in the armor and school, and went to Kentucky to do my training.
How long were you?
I was 6 months active down in Kentucky, and then I was 7.5 years inactive. Monthly meetings and summer camps.
As a reservist.
And I retired in '67 as a captain.
Okay. What about your family?
Well, I had one sister, a couple years younger, who also went to USD. And we were the only two children, my parents, Herman and Mabel. Dad was very active on the ranch right up until he died at age 75. My mother lived there until 2 days before she died at 88. So they were a ranch family through and through.
And then I know your son, Kurt. Can you
Yes.
talk a little about your wife and kids?
Well, I was practicing law in Sioux Falls in 1967 with the Boyce firm, Jeremiah Murphy, Russ Greenfield. And I'd met Martha that spring or year, and I had known of her. She was way more famous than me at USD. But anyway, we were both single people, unattached at the time we were dating, started to date, and I convinced her, I'm sure she wonders why, but to marry me in June. And just at that time, one of the great role models in my life, John Jones, who ended up being a federal circuit judge, contacted me and wanted me to buy his insurance agency and take over his law practice out of Presho.
Okay.
And I had been in Kennebec for 6-7 months earlier before I went to work for Russ. And so I had gotten to know him. And that presented a great professional and financial opportunity for me. And so I opted to leave the very good law firm and moved to Presho and built a house, started a family, and lived there 20 years.
So I went a little out of order, I guess. So when did you go to law school? That must have been after the...
After college, yeah, I was back on the sheep ranch for a couple of years. I started law school in the fall of 1962. George Mickelson was in my class, became a very close friend. Graduated in June of 1965.
Is that when you first met George?
First met George in law school. Yeah.
You'd have been just a little older than
I
him?
was 4 years older.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were law school classmates. You got out. You went to Sioux Falls. Judge Jones, was he selling because he was appointed a judge?
He was appointed a circuit judge in South Dakota and
Okay.
wanted me to take over a very active, very good law practice.
Sure.
Make more money than I was in Sioux Falls by about
Sure.
5 times is all. But
So then you're back in Presho, kind of your home country. We're kind of getting into the 70s then. Were you politically active in the 70s, or that was kind of what was your involvement in those days?
well,
That Knipe era?
like I said, I was practicing pressure, and I became a friend of course, Jim Abdnor. He was in the state government, and Bob Burns, over at Vivian, and he was very active. He and Abdnor were friends, and it was tough times to be a Republican, by the way. And Bob recruited me to be with Lawrence Steele to be the co-finance chairman, this 1970, of the State Republican Party. So we would go up, phone calls, knock on doors, trying to get enough money collected to keep the door open. But so that was my first involvement really in state government, state politics anyway, and of course became involved in Jim's campaigns and Bill Janklow's run for Attorney General. I was on the state central committee, so I knew all of the power brokers, I guess, if you would, in Republican politics, and introduced Bill to him and told him he wasn't quite as crazy as his reputation was, because he had gotten out of law school and gone out to Mission running the OEO and did a really good job.
The
out
legal
there.
aid office,
Yep.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
I want to come back to Janko and Abdnor. I just thought of something, though, I wanted to ask before we get too far ahead. Did you ever meet or come across M.Q. Sharp? You say being in Kennebec in the...
Well, yeah, I worked in that law firm.
Oh, okay.
And not too long after he died. And in fact, but Mr. Sharp had died by the time I went to the firm. But I worked for John Larson, and I was working, trying to straighten out some of the stuff on his estate when they got ready to close it. So.
And then that Herb Sundahl ended up being in that firm too, right?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. Good man. Yeah. In fact, Herb, when I went to Pierre, most of my corporate and estate clients I sent to Herb.
Okay, I see. Okay, coming back around then, you mentioned Janko. I've been interested at different times to have people tell me what they thought of Janko when they first met him. What was your impression of Janko way back in those early days?
Well, he was kind of wild and crazy, a nonconformist. And my first contact, really, with Bill, kind of negative. I was elected when I was a junior, end of my junior year, elected president of our student body. And Bill was always involved in student government down there. He and Averask and a couple of buddies. I was not. And Robert's Rules of Order was not imprinted in the back of my head. So when I was elected this day at the spring deal, we were, it was kind of an informal body, and that's how we conducted stuff. We nominated Lee McCarran to go and put some money behind him to some national convention. And Bill and a couple of his buddies objected to the method, and told the dean that we had not run the meeting. I had not run the meeting according to Robert's Rules of Order, which I had not. Dean called me in and said, "Frank, you're supposed to be young lawyers following rules. I think you need to rerun the meeting," which we did, and I apologized for the lack of knowledge on how to properly conduct a meeting. But I immediately informed Bill that he was to stay in his seat until I recognized him, and the biggest guy in the class I nominated as the Sergeant at Arms and said, "Bill, you will stay there until I recognize you or he will remove you." So then we ran the meeting according to Hoyle, if you will, and and Bill conducted it himself. And, he was a very interesting, good student, smart, but he was always kind of on the edge in terms of just non-traditional stuff. But when he went out to Rosebud, I was in Prussia, and I was on his advisory committee, and good supporter of his.
Was Larry Pressler in school at that time too? Or was he a little younger?
He's younger, and I think he might have been an undergraduate when I started. I did not know Larry. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, back to the 70s then. I want to talk a little bit about Jim Abdnor.
Okay.
And you said you were involved with his campaigns. I know he was lieutenant governor, ran for Congress once and lost, then ran again and won when Aberist ran for Senate.
Yes.
And then was in the House for the rest of the 70s there. Can you talk a little about what he was like, why he was so successful, and what your involvement was with him?
Well, first met Jim when I was high school, played some baseball against Kennebec, and he was the coach, town team baseball, and then I was a good high school basketball player, and Jim, of course, recognized, paid attention to kids that were that, as he did later with John Thune and others. So when I went to work for John Larson out there, I got acquainted with Jim. And so then when Sioux Falls came back, and that's when Jim was running for Congress. And of course, if you were in Lyman County, you were an Abdnor supporter. He had a great following. He's such a people person, and people that wanted to be in public service and in governments of all level should take a case study of Jim and how he met people. He made you feel that you were the most important person in the world when he was talking to, took an interest in you and your family, and understood it and remembered it. So I had a history with him, and I had a cute wife, and Jim liked to, in a very, very proper way, get women to help support his efforts and stuff. So it was a natural for Martha and I to volunteer and work, address envelopes, do stuff, and then later I helped raise money for him. But my first contact, probably on a political.
We got a microphone cut out there.
Oh.
I'm not quite sure what happened. So I guess start again, I guess whatever that last question was, in case we missed it.
Okay, well, let's just go back around to Abdnor.
Okay.
And kind of give a little more about your involvement with his campaigns,
Okay.
and then
Okay.
I'm sure you were involved when he ran against George McGovern.
Yes, very much.
And
Yeah.
if you could talk about that.
Okay. Well, to begin with, my first involvement, I was, as I said, Bob Burns was chairman, and I think 1970, and I was on the Central Committee. so there was an open house seat, and Jim was running against Fred Brady in the primary.
Right.
And I really wasn't that much involved in that campaign because I was busy with Bob and the Senate. Munt had died, and that was a big race. But Jim got beat by Brady. And I talked to him the next day, and you could tell by visiting with him that he wasn't done. He was got up off the floor and was ready to go again in '72. And at that time, I became very involved in his '72 House race, and which, well, I think maybe in '72 he ran against McGovern,
I think that's right.
who was a friend and had been a roommate of mine.
Oh.
And so that was a little conflicting, but Jim won that one, and then every year after until the McGovern issue. And during that time, I had in his House years, I had started to do some legal work and stuff for him. I did a lot of tax work in my practice. So I would go into Washington every spring and get his information, and sometimes Martha would go, sometimes she didn't. But so I became a very close personal friend and advisor of him. So, and he loved being in the House, and of course it was a minority side, so it was not really that taxing. You know, he would come back and go to bean feeds in Buffalo and wherever. Loved him. Then come 1980, when McGovern had not even carried South Dakota when he ran for president, so he was decided to run again in '80. McGovern did, and the Republicans were all chomping at the bit, and that had been the motivating factor many times. So when you're a Republican during the Knipe years, was figuring out a way to badmouth George and to beat him, and so that the candidacy. And Jim was reluctant, and he was at my kitchen table, and I said, Abdnor, this is a no-brainer. I mean, McGovern's not very popular. People are finding a reason to vote against him, and all you have to do is be acceptable,
Right.
Keep your mouth shut, don't get in trouble, and run. Well, he didn't want to, was reluctant to take the risk of giving up a sure win, but he was going to have to run against Daschle anyway.
2 years later.
2 years later. So I said, Jim, you got to do this. And he did, and of course won, and it was one of those typical elections, as we have found out later in the national political game, that a lot of people vote against somebody and not for somebody.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the case there. So Jim was elected, and I remember the night of the election in '80 very well.
It was a good Republican year.
Great Republican.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan and
Right.
Clint Roberts, another Lyman County guy, Jim Abdnor. Yeah,
Well, since you mentioned Clint Roberts, let's talk about him for a second.
okay.
You knew him. He was right in your country there.
Oh, yeah, I played basketball against Clinton High School, and a good friend from Myrtle married she was a sister of Bev, yeah, and did work for him, and great man, good man.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, let's, if you're kind of move into the Mickelson campaign then. So, of course, Mickelson ran for governor in 1986.
Yeah.
how early were you involved with that campaign, and do you know why he decided to run and what his thinking was on running for governor?
Well, going back to law school in the 60s, public service was always of great interest to all of the Mickelson kids and George, as it was me. I was raised wanting to argue about things I didn't know anything about,
Right.
and so I always told George that if he ever ran, or when he ran, I think it was kind of understood that he would get involved in public service and government. And of course, he had been in the service and back, went to work in Brookings,
Yep.
and then was in the legislature, took the steps up, became speaker, then went home to help raise the kids. And then when there was an opening, a seat, a retired governor that wasn't running for re-election, then that's the time to step in and say I'm interested. And so I got involved early. I was on his group from around the state that was his kitchen cabinet, maybe let's call it that.
Sure.
So,
Who else would have been?
Marvis Hogan was from
Yep.
Kadoka. Of course, Sid Bostic,
Yep.
Tom Graham.
Was it Dwight Adams?
Dwight was the campaign chairman.
Yep.
And then Tom Adam, of course, his brother-in-law,
Yep.
was very much involved. I think Homer Harding might have been a good supporter. He had somebody from Aberdeen that was, the great thing about George from college and then law school and then legislature, he had acquaintance and friends
Yeah.
about at every key point around the state, so there was a great collection of people that knew him and supported him and thought he would be a great candidate.
Now, having said that, he was not probably the front runner when he decided to
No,
run.
I don't think so. I think, well,
Because you have Clint Roberts, who
Yeah.
was talked about.
yeah, and from my hometown.
Yeah.
And I didn't make a lot of friends, being a big supporter of George. And then Lowell Hanson, of course, the lieutenant governor, who I think probably might have been the choice of the outgoing administration, a lot of those people. So it was a real crowded field of very good candidates.
And Lowell lives here in town. He just lives
Yeah, he
right down the
does.
street
Yeah,
from me.
go to coffee with him.
Do you? Yeah. And then Alice Kundert ran too.
That is correct. Got 10%.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, talk a little bit about that primary campaign. What was the issues, and why do you think? I know it was very close with George and Clint Roberts.
Yeah.
Why do you think Mickelson?
Well, he outworked everybody, and it was retail politics for George. I mean, he, like I said, he knew people in the key areas, and he would go in there. Mark Mickelson, I think, was his driver.
We're interviewing Mark this afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I mean, nothing Mickelson liked better than pressing the flesh with people. He was good at it. He loved it. And he just worked his butt off. Plus, the other money is the key. You had to get enough to do it right. But Clint got a little lazy at the end, I think, kind of thought he had it. And Clint, wonderful. And nobody had a better neighbor, apparently, than Clint Roberts. And his word was solid. But he was a little withdrawn as opposed to Mickelson.
Okay.
And George just outworked him. And, of course, he knew all these people from his college, law school, legislative days. He just had a huge relationship of people around the state.
Sure. So he wins the primary. Were you involved with his choice of Walter Dale?
I was not.
And
I was not.
do you have any insight into his thinking there?
Oh, well,
Who else
sure.
he might have considered, or why he chose Walt?
Well, first of all, George was an attorney from Brookings, and we lawyers sometimes aren't the most popular animals in town, and of course, West River being very important in Republican primaries, and Walter Dale, which is what he was known. Everybody, it's not Walter; it's one word, Walter Dale.
Right.
And had a good reputation in Rapid and Meade County is where he's from, and so it was logical to pick someone from out west, and Walt was a logical choice. I think.
They'd served in the House leadership.
Oh
together,
yeah,
so they
yeah,
knew each other.
yeah. They knew each other, and were friends.
Yeah.
And that was awfully important to George, and so that was a good choice for him, I thought.
Yeah. Okay, so then going into the general election, I know the Democratic primary had been between Lars Herseth and Knipe.
I don't think so. Knipe had resigned, and Harvey Woolman, I think, finished out that
Right.
term, and then Woolman was challenged by Roger McKillops, I
In
think,
78, right.
in 78, and yes, in 78. I'm getting behind myself. And then Lars, I don't know who challenged.
But at any rate, Lars was the Democratic.
Oh
opponent
yeah,
in
and a good
86,
and a
so-
good candidate. And
So can you talk a little bit about Lars?
well, I did not know Lars at that time, but he was an outstanding candidate, knowledgeable, well-spoken, had money. Apparently, too much of it was his own, but he and the big issue was income tax, as I recall.
Right.
Lars wanted an income tax to fund state government,
Sure.
and George was opposed, but that was tough campaign, and George worked and had not excessive amounts, but had money enough to do a good advertising campaign. But again, he hit the road, worked his butt off, and but that election night in '86, I recall being up at Brookings. It was even going across the river.
And George won that by what?
10,000 votes.
Yeah, it was a close
Five
result, really.
Yeah, 5 or 6 came out of Pennington County. They never let him forget it, but it was late into the night before it was finally. And that same night, of course, Jim lost to Daschle.
Right. And before we move on from '86, I should ask about the Janklow-Abdnor primary.
You really want to talk about that?
Well, not if you don't.
No, I do, because that was the beginning of Bill Janklow and Frank Brost splitting in terms of our likability and our support for each other. But Bill lied to me. I was a big supporter of his when he was governor. Gave him money, and I was a friend of Jim's. And I had witnessed what had happened in Republican politics back in the 70s when the Senate race between Hirsch and Midland and Schock caused a split that
In 72, right?
in 72.
Right.
Knipe got elected, and it had a hard time healing. And don't tell me that competitive primaries are good for a party. They aren't, because a lot of people have hard feelings. They might not vote for the other guy. They just stay home and keep their money in their pocket.
And that Janklow-Abdnor primary seems like that split lasted for decades.
Still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so do you want to take a break? Before
Yeah,
we get
that's
into-
fine, yeah.
Okay, let's take it. All right, so we talked about 1986. George was elected, took office that January of '87. You were the chief of staff. How did that come about? Is that a job you wanted, or?
I don't think anybody wants that job. But, well, I'd been in pressure 20 years, and what we were doing as small-town lawyers had started to kind of diminish, examining abstracts, title insurance taken over, less people. I had a big probate practice, and I was 50, and it was time to move on. I decided, and my kids were getting ready for college, and so time of my life to change what I was doing. George came through one cold day in January and picked me up, and I took him on through Lyman County down to Chamberlain to meet people, and a couple people that got slivers for not telling us that they'd support him or somebody else. They paid later, I might add. But anyway, I said, George, I'm going to leave. I'm going to do something else. And if you get elected, I wouldn't mind working for you for a year or two until I figured out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. All this time, of course, I had been building a ranching operation up in Jones County. I'd bought another ranch and added on to my parents and stuff. So it was kind of important that I kind of stay someplace fairly close. No more discussion. And that night in Brookings, when he won, and I'd been involved giving him money and helping advise in the campaign meetings. And he said, well, do you think we can run this place? And I thought, well, what's that about anyway? So I left and went down to Sioux Falls to hold Jim's hand, if you will, because he was beaten by Dashiell. Right. And a couple days later, George said, well, I want you to be my chief of staff, but I want you to move to Pierre. Well, that was not an issue. And I said, well, Herm Solem, I'd been on the Board of Charities and Corrections and the chairman a couple of years for Bill.
Wasn't George on that board?
No, George was Pardons and Parole.
Oh, Pardons and Paroles, okay.
And I was on the
Charities and Corrections.
Charities and Corrections. I was Bill's first big appointment on that board and others, and carried a lot of water for him on it. And anyway, I said, George, I've never done anything like that. I said, I don't know what that job entails. He said, well, I've never been governor before. He said, come on up and we'll learn together. So I did and we did. But that's because, first of all, the job, as you know, is what your boss wants to make it.
Right.
And
so how did it work when you were chief of staff?
Well, the first thing he did was sent me to a session at Duke University for young chiefs on what to do, not to, more importantly, what not to do.
Right.
And I met there at the chief for Branstead out of Iowa, good guy. Mm-hmm. And when I wanted some advice, I'd call him, get a little insight. But, they told me, as I said, you statutorily you do not have a job. You have what the governor wants you to do. And but they said to me, you keep your name out of the paper, not in the paper, and you figure out what your role is and what he wants it to be. So I became, Jenklow had an operations man, Jim Myers, and
Right.
he had then a kind of a limited chief of staff.
Right.
But I became both, and I really became Tony the operations guy for all of the cabinet level people funneled through me
And the staff.
and the staff. Yeah, so I had a very busy job,
Yes.
and but he was a great boss. He probably, I think some people thought he gave more power to me than I should have had. I disagreed with that, of course.
I know how that feels. So talk a little bit, just kind of expand on that. What was the daily life like in that job? Who were some of the key people who you worked with?
Well, good question. Nobody, Mickelson led by example. He got to work for everybody else, and I tried to keep up. Tough job, and but he had an open door, and one of the things I learned at that chief's meal meeting was when you select key people to help you run government in your final group, make sure you don't get any real bad choices in there, because
Right.
you might not always pick the best guy ultimately, but you don't pick any bad ones, because if you do and make mistakes, it takes you a couple years to get rid of them,
And they don't get any better.
and they don't get any better.
Right.
And you've got to hard decisions. And the other thing, of course, I learned that's about 3 days into the job that, if I may here,
Yeah.
regress a little bit,
Yeah.
because I was new. George knew all the legislators,
Right.
and he put them in groups of threes. Shelley Stingley was helpful because she had been in the prior administration, and so we and brought them all in. He introduced them to me, and it was, the polite man that he was, and said, whatever you're working on, if we can, we'll help you, and all of this and that.
Sure.
And it'd be about a half an hour get to know each other confab. Well, one of them was, he thought he was Republican. I didn't think he was, from up northeast. And he had some goofy idea that, later I would have thrown him plumb out of the office. But Mickelson, listened to him and talked to the others. And he said, well, if we can help, let us know. We'll help you with your legislation. He went upstairs and told Jan Nicolai and some of them that Mickelson had signed off on this. About 30 minutes later, I don't think she even knocked on my door. I think she just barged in and said, Jan,
Yeah.
said, did Mickelson agree to do that? I said, gosh, no. He didn't throw him out of the office, but he, well, he's upstairs telling everybody, the Republican caucus, that this goofy idea. And
Some
so
legislators have a habit of hearing what they want.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, I decided right then and there that in this administration, the governor is the good guy, and I have to be the bad guy. So that was number one lesson. And throughout my career, Tony, I recognized that. And, I did make a lot of friends sometimes doing it, but I was pretty firm in what no meant. And but my door was always open to people come in and try to convince them why the boss's position was the best position. And I learned also always give people a back door when you were dealing with them in negotiation. And but he had the ability to track some awfully good people and to help him govern. And they some really good people, and that made governing so much easier because there was a lot of things going on in his administration.
You were talking about it, kind of made me think. I don't know what you think about term limits, but it's always seemed to me that period in the 80s was kind of a golden age for. We had a lot of these legislators who'd been there a long time and were in the leadership. And
Yeah, it
we were
was.
talking about Homer Harding before we started recording, and Shannard and Halverson, and
Yeah.
you mentioned Jen Nicolai.
Yeah,
Can
and
you
over
talk
in
a
the
little about
House,
that?
yeah, I can. I term limits is good, but it's bad. I mean, and for state government to, the guy that originated it down here, he was all offended because he never got to be a committee chairman. And they started term limits and, called him in the Leader in Life one time on a committee. And, we were trying to do it with the federal government. That ain't dumbest guy in the world to know that wasn't going to work in South Dakota. But, you lose, one of the very best legislators I ever met was Larry Gabriel from the Phillip area. Knowledgeable, did his homework. And Larry and Lammers, Jerry, they, Don Ham, they were experienced people. Bernie Christensen was there. They helped us immensely get our stuff through that first session. We hadn't been able to put together a staff to go upstairs, and
it's tough that first session.
Because
you don't have any time to get
no time to get ready. And George had a big agenda. The Ready Fund and the Futures Fund were big deals. Raising a penny sales tax, to fund it didn't go down well with a lot of Republicans. And he that first and they. What the chief of staff was doing, and they were dumping mail on me, that's where Diana Miller had been doing. Well, I didn't think that was my role. I dumped that back to somebody. But to figure out what the heck was going on, come from a little old law practice. I'd been on the Board of Charities and Corrections, so I had a real good knowledge of what was going on in that area and how the legislature works somewhat. But he worked his butt off and get on the airplane, go to different chamber meetings and whoever he could meet with around the state, get back at midnight, show back up at 7:30 in the morning to sell that penny sales tax and to the legislature, but to the impacted groups. And we got those, he just through grit and hard work and his salesmanship to raise that penny, because I had been with him in a meeting with Janklow, in December.
This is during the transition
Yes.
time? Yep.
And I was trying to button down a law practice, so I couldn't devote full time to going up there and learning what was going on. And Bill was telling him, the economy was tough. I mean, it was egg sector was tough. Sales, sales returns, sales tax was down. And Bill said, well, I think, you ought to sell the cement plant. And he was always wanting to do that for $20 million and, and hope the economy gets better. I don't know if George said it then or later. And he said, well, I'm not going to sit around here and manage misery. I'm going to make stuff happen or go do something else with my life. And I remember being in a meeting then with Tom Adam and maybe Dwight, and he proposed raising the penny sales tax. Well, the hair stood up, that's not a Republican deal. But he sold it, and he did it, and it worked. And it's still working. And it was one of the transitional things that happened in state government in my lifetime. And
so why was that? So we're talking about the Ready Fund, which
yes,
was the sales tax increase basically financed a revolving loan
fund.
Yeah. And then the Future Fund is a grant. Can you talk a little bit about how those worked and why they were important?
Well, the Futures Fund, a woman that was Julie, I think, I don't know, from Aberdeen.
Johnson?
Julie Johnson.
Yeah, we're interviewing her tomorrow. Oh,
okay. Well, she was kind of the tell her I gave her credit for the idea of she said we've got an excess amount of money in the UI unemployment insurance fund that it's overfunded, she said, I think, you can cut it or do something with it. Well, George was, because of Dwight Adam and then, the old guy that came in, worked for us, was the head of engineering at South Dakota State.
Yes. I know who you mean, and
Yeah.
I can't think of his name.
Yeah.
either.
And he and the
Buckley.
Buckley, Ernie.
Yeah, right.
And he and the president of Mines helped create the agenda for the Futures Fund and the Ready Fund, And so this was a money source. And in the higher ed, of course, George wanted to create a good working relationship with higher ed and state government, which he did. But the research dollars into South Dakota State School of Mines, particularly, was less than Puerto Rico at the time. And so how do you get startup money to be able to apply for these federal grants with this federal program? Well, here was the source. And so we diverted money from that into the Futures Fund. Futures being designed for the future and research and development, R&D stuff at the colleges and universities. And of course, to facilitate that and run it, you had to create a new department, GOED, Governor's, which became a cabinet position.
Right.
And then he also created a cabinet position for tourism. So he really focused on the, as he put it, the asset side of the balance sheet, not the liability side, which Charities and Corrections, where I was first, was a big liability side. But anyway, those funds were created, and you had to get statutory authority through the legislature for both of them. And so they became part of the Bellwater things that we stood for and promoted throughout his administrative years.
And you mentioned tourism. That was Governor, they did a lot to promote tourism
Yeah.
and kind of advance that too. Can you
Can we
talk?
wait till the beeping is done?
Okay, yeah, let's pause a minute. Do we know what that is?
I do not know.
All right, so we were talking about tourism promotion.
Yeah, good. Well, George ran on one of the issues in his campaign was making a cabinet level position out of tourism. And of course there were, big issues. That's always has been a major part of our industry, all the people we bring through. So Mount Rushmore and developing destination places along the Missouri River, from Mobridge and protected harbors, if you will, and putting some money into building lodges. And so we did that.
That was like the Cedar Shores and
Cedar Shores,
Grand Coda and Pier.
yes,
Yeah.
and then Yankton, that
Okay.
that place was built at that dam, built a protective harbor, and then funding some game fish and parks cabins construction.
Right.
So along the river was a big part. Susan Edwards was a big part of it. But then also, very important, not many people recognize that the Custer State Park, under the supervision, bad as it is sometimes, under game fish and parks, that ought to separate parks from game and fish, but there had been a deterioration of the three major facilities. Management was not good. One of them was Bill's brother, and
Art.
Art
Yep.
had a lot of complaints into the office about him. And so how to fund it? And of course, the other thing I want to talk about is the water project.
Yes.
But let's get to this first.
Sure.
And so, how to create a bonding authority to build new facilities at the three main facilities up there. And that took a lot of work, and finding outside interests to come in and build it, because that's a huge benefit out of state. People coming in and wanting to visit it. Of course, the nearness to Mount Rushmore, which is the great attraction. So that was another big effort we did. Then, of course, something important want to relate to you was Susan Edwards, Myrtle girl, had a brother Guy, who I knew was in a legislature, had gone out to Sturgis. And he kept wanting it in the early days. Everybody wants to get in and see the boss, to promote something that might or might not need promoted. But, you got to get Guy in to see Georgia. Okay, so I said, Governor, we got to carve out a half an hour for Guy Edwards. He's got some idea he wants. Well, it was the Rails to Trails issue, and he was at Sturgis and was a promoter of it. And the Burlington Northern, I think they'd already maybe picked up the track. That was the one that ran from Deadwood on through the hills. And they'd started to tear up the bridges. And there was a federal Rails to Trails federal program that if you adopted it and did certain things, that the federal government would reimburse the railroad for those types of things. Of course, he hadn't been in there 5 minutes, and Mickelson got all over that thing. Said, "Oh yeah, we want to do this." So that exploded, and I think they'd torn down one bridge or something, and so we got it stopped, and that began the effort to create the Rails to Trails, which is now a nationally recognized trail from Edgemont clear up to Deadwood. A wonderful, wonderful attraction for out-of-state, in-state, and whoever. So that was another thing.
And named for Governor Mickelson.
And named for Governor Mickelson.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then you wanted to talk about water, too.
Okay, water. And that was one of the things that probably might be the most unknown, unrecognized, transitional things that we did. Right after the first session, George had all these things lined up that he wanted to talk to congressional people about. And we went, he and I'm supposed to be the staffer and get him to places on time. Anyway, Barb Reed had set all these appointments up, one of which, we talked to Bill Bradley about the giving away the Black Hills. I told him I had a little recognition of contact with the experience with Native American people, where I grew up and had land on the reservation, worked with certain, so I had some opinions that he obviously didn't agree with, and I expressed to him. But anyway, we met with a person named Miller, who was, of course, the House was all Democrat at that time. And he was the chairman of the committee that funded or at least authorized water projects throughout the country. And we were still suffering from Carter's years of terminating the irrigation projects on the Oahe. Yeah. Anyway, we sat down and Mr. Miller said, "I want to tell you, Governor," he said, "we're not funding any more irrigation projects." Said, "That's out. We have lots of money to fund rural water systems, and you have a great need in South Dakota for rural water stuff." Well, I was had been a Lyman and Jones County and at a ranch and farm outside Presho, and I knew of the needs, and we had some work on the West River Lyman Jones rural water project. Nothing had really gotten off the ground on it. But he said, you need to adopt a rural water plan in your state and figure out what projects, timeline, and how to go with it. But more importantly,
Speaking of water.
yeah, speaking of water. Excuse me. But he said you need to figure out a funding source for about 25 to 30% to match before you can get the project approved. So Mickelson would come back, calls in his DE&R person, and put him to work affecting the impacted rural water period. Webb, and then there was Mid-Dakota, West River, Lyman Jones. Yankton had something going, and I don't know if the one that got water up here to Sioux Falls and yet had started.
I don't think so.
I don't think it had been on the drawing board yet. But anyway, we went around the state and had meetings with the different groups. Came back, the legislature, Larry Gabriel was big on helping get that legislation in the House, of course, and started, and developed the plan and got it passed and then sent it to Washington. Well, Daschle, of course, was there. Pressler was there. Tim Johnson at the time, 3 people. And, of course, then once you get the plan, then you have to get authorization to get it in. Then once you get the authorization, then you go get the funding. Well, that was the inception of finishing Webb, and Mid-Dakota was a huge new project. And, of course, West River Lyman Jones, that was supposed to put water out to Kadoka and Phillip. And then Tom Daschle, the Indians, Pine Ridge and Rosebud had huge needs. They had no funding, so he got the Many-Wachoni, where the federal government met the reservation, the Indian nations match for it. So that became a huge project, and I don't know. And then, of course, the one at Sioux Falls from Yankton on up. So that, and I know because I had sites on my ranch that had we not had the rural water during those 80s or 2000s, a lot of livestock would have left South Dakota because the dams and the sources had all dried up. And so it had a huge impact out west, of course. Sioux Falls right now, 200 and some thousand people, or 250 in the metropolitan area. Water's so important, and throughout the country it is. But anyway, that was an impact, began with George Mickelson's vision, and to put the effort in getting it passed. And I think one of the hallmark things in the long-lasting effects of his administration that everybody doesn't know about. I mean, it wasn't one of the high profiles. But anyway, that's my thoughts on that issue. But
another thing that people remember Governor Mickelson for, I think, is the year of reconciliation.
Oh yeah,
trying to improve tribal relations.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah. Well, his father practiced up in Selby, and had, I think, expressed to George the issue of Native American involvement and rights and stuff. I'm going to talk about myself a little bit. My first job out of law school, was working for the old Sharp firm, and John Larson sent me up one day a week to be the chief finance officer for the Crow Creek tribe, and they had just got empowered under Nixon for more self-control and stuff. And of course, so I was aware, and they'd gotten a settlement on the dams, and they had these programs that they could spend the interest off of, not the principal. So I had some Indian governing knowledge and interest. But George had a great interest in trying to improve the relationships. And under Janklow, I'm not being very critical, he had kind of gotten his reputation through Wounded Knee and being anti-Native, when in fact he had done a lot of good things in terms of representing unrepresented people in the legal system. So there was some healing, in my opinion, that needed to be done. And of course, no one was better at making people comfortable and healing and doing that stuff than George Mickelson. So, and of course, then at the same time, we had passed legalized gaming.
Right, I was going to ask about that.
Okay, well, one of the tribes that we had worked with was Flandreau, and Judy Peterson was the chairman down there. And she had supported George, I think, in the election stuff. So, she was an opening, and he called them all together. Well, the first thing you learn in trying to deal with 9 tribes is don't try to pass one rule fixes all. They all think they're an independent nation. To an extent, some areas they are. And so you kind of have to deal with them individually. But he really put together this, and the Indian people still, I think, hold him out as a great leader from their perspective. As you know, revenue is the big issue for them, finding ways to get more money, sharing the sales tax or the tax on new cars and different stuff, the revenue treatment agreements with each tribe individually. I think those things, they're 9-10% of our population, 15% of the new students. The growth in South Dakota is around Indian reservations, and jurisdiction's a terribly thorny issue, and I have a lot of really opinionated opinions on what's wrong with the way we're going or the way they're going on that. But enough on that.
Yeah.
I was not in a circle smoking the peace pipe. First of all, I don't smoke. But anyway.
Well, we could spend a whole nother session just on that topic.
Yeah.
You mentioned gaming, though. Can you talk a little? That was a major change.
Sure it was.
that Governor Mickelson
Big.
made. Deadwood and video lottery
Yep.
and the whole
Yep.
thing.
Yeah, I can. And I was very much involved in that. We, of course, George did not. The '86 election was not a supporter of legalized gambling, but Deadwood people did a great job in Deadwood, you bet, and it passed in a very limited form. And so the first thing to do is hire somebody to run it. Well, he picked one of the most efficient, capable employees of the Janklow administration, Susan Walker.
Yeah.
She's an attorney. Father Bruce was in the legislature to run it, and run it she did very well. And of course, yes, first of all, had to start getting the rules and regs put together, adopted by the Rules Committee. And then we had the scratch and match was the first authorization things. In fact, we used the scratch and match revenue to fund the bond issue for the water projects.
Oh.
that was the revenue source. And Larry Gabriel was big in getting that legislation through in that session. But the video lottery people came to him and said, well, we'd like to push that. And George says, I'm not supporting that this first session. I need to get my stuff through. Yeah. And he said, but the next time, I won't oppose it and I'll help you. Well, so that would have been in the 88 session. Video lottery came and it passed. And then, of course, what to do with the revenue, how much, and what the rates were. Right. Well, there was, in my opinion, a false perception that was all dedicated to education. Right. Well,
that still comes up.
Yeah, and it's wrong. I was never a part of it. Maybe George, and some of them tried to promote it that way. Right. Well, there's no question, but had we not had video lottery, the state funding for education couldn't have been what it was. Right. But the first session, Ellenbecker kept coming over from the expanded Medicaid needs and saying, I want 6 or 7 million of the new money, and the rest of you people go fight over 5 bones. And that offended me, of course. And but the first time, I think we'd have been without money if we hadn't had that 7 or 8 million of new money to put into social services. But so, and then the issue of raising the rates. But you had to let them get their machines paid for and get good machines in to start creating the the operational efficiencies to generate, because you were in a partnership with them. So Susan ran that and ran it well. But George's position was always, it's going to be squeaky clean. And I think we have done that, Tony.
I think so.
Throughout different administrations. But it's, it's the equivalent of a penny sales tax, or it was back then.
That's right.
And very important revenue source. And the other issue came about, and this was one of my stories. They said, oh, gambling is bad. Well, why don't you talk to the Legion and the Catholic Church to get the brown machines out of their basements? And right. Nobody wanted to talk about that. But that was going on all over, and then the people in different gambling stuff, in fact, that law firm I had, old John McDowell and Murphy, they kind of ran an in-house bet deal back, placing bets on big-time stuff. So, there are certain of us that don't feel that that's really a total bad thing unless you abuse it. Right. And I was big into funding through Human Services. I think we were putting up $500,000 to $1 million to take care of gaming addiction problems that we had created, and to help people with a problem get it fixed. I think Jenkel immediately did away with that, and I don't know in your administration if we still fund those things.
I think we do.
But that's very important, in my opinion.
You mentioned a couple other topics there I want to hit on, Mickelson. The first one, you're talking about Human Services.
Yes.
It's interesting because you were the chair of the Board of Charities and Corrections.
2 terms.
But then you guys got rid of that board.
Well, that was my deal. And we were trying to, when I was on the board, there was huge needs in corrections. I was the point person at the pen. How are we going to build new facilities? Well, here's this 5-person board with no clout coming up with a plan, and it became very apparent to me that unless you get that authority under the governor where he can get his shoulders behind the needs and find the funding source to pay for it, because it's a big price tag, it's not going to happen. So, and George was on pardons and paroles, so he understood the overcrowding issue and the needs as well as I did. So, one of the young people that was still working for us when I went to work, And somebody asked him about Brost. Said, well, he knows a lot about charities and corrections, but he doesn't know much about anything else. So anyway, so I did. I pushed it, and of course George got behind it, and we went out. I did with staff and met with a lot of the impacted parties to say we need to do this, and mental health needs attention. We hired a young guy, Bill Garnis, who was over in DENR, I think, smart young guy, came over and kind of was my chief staffer in doing stuff. He went on to a big career in building corrections stuff, but it was a constitutional amendment put to the vote in '88, I think, and it passed. So then we had the obligation to create a Department of Human Services Center, mental health stuff, and then the Department of Corrections, which then we got behind the issue of building the Jameson, adding more stuff to Springfield, and
The new hospital in Yankton.
and a new hospital in Yankton, $30 million project. This one here was 16, and we did it with help of Democrats. You know, I went into because the last 2 years we had a Democrat Senate, so I'd have to go up there and take a whipping, and
How'd that happen that the Democrats won the Senate?
Well, George Shannard got beat in Mitchell because there was a conflict. He had an equity interest in something out at Chamberlain. They used that to beat him over the head. Daschle, this is another issue that I think needs to be brought out. Not many people know about it. This is my conspiracy theory. But Bill Janko and Tom Daschle made an agreement way back when, in the 70s, when I was working with Bob Burns. George McGovern was a senator. The National Committee man would be the person keeping track of George McGovern in the Senate. When he said and did stuff back there that it wasn't released in the papers back here, National Committee man would make sure it was. So he was true squad, if you will, on George. Well, it's my opinion that Bill and Tom made an agreement that Tom would keep his money out of the legislative races when Bill was governor, and Bill would keep his national committeeman and state chairman shut about criticizing Tom or running a truth squad on what Tom said back in Washington. Nice partnership agreement. We did not have that with Tom. And Tom put some money into some key Senate races. That was the revenue stream to help fund them. They put up some good candidates, and we probably had some ones that extended too long. I can't remember all, but George Shannard's race was one of them, and we got beat. We lost by one vote. So Bill Janko learned early to make sure that he helped. He legislated because he wanted a supermajority, so you could last minute change the rules, and
Makes a big difference.
makes a huge difference. Anyway, you ask how it happened. I think money and recruiting good candidates in key races.
The last big topic on the Mickelson administration is education. Can you
Yes.
talk a little about what work you did there? And
Yeah, well, that was another issue he ran on, was more funding, and higher and lower. I was on a school board 12 years down in Lyman County. Education was an interest. I was on state associated school boards, so I was pretty well steeped from local education issues. And of course, SDSU and Ernie Buckley, Dr. Schlesinger was Big Sport, School of Mines, higher ed stuff.
Schleusner. wasn't
Schleusner,
it?
yep.
Right.
His son did back surgery on me.
Oh.
Good people. But anyway, they were helped create his higher ed policies and stuff. So getting more money into higher ed was important. The Futures Fund, of course,
Yep.
was a big money source for those kinds of things. And
Technical colleges grew a lot during that time.
yes,
too, didn't they?
yes, they really did. And of course, governance, as you know,
Right.
it's a huge issue. Local school boards were governing, and that wasn't working. They didn't know what the heck the statewide needs were and stuff. So I don't know if we created, or maybe Janklow did in his second 8-year term, or where Dugard was on it, but to create a statewide governance board was darn important for those and getting funding into them. They are the future of higher ed in many instances, I feel. And George did too. He was a big supporter of that. But then, Ernie Buckley ended up running the Board of Regents, and he was the Dean of Engineering and a big supporter. So creating a cooperative effort between higher ed and state government was a hallmark, I think, of our deal. And then finding funding for K-12. And this is one of the things that we did, and Janklow undid it, was dedicated 52.5% of the sales tax, statutorily created, to K-12 education. So they would have a growing revenue stream, would grow with the economy instead of begging and being the last funding legislation in the Appropriations Committee to them. But Bill undid that. But that was key. And then I don't know if, I think, to help facilitate education, the word I'm grappling for, putting together, and I was involved very much in it in Lyman County. Consolidation's the word.
Right.
And the biggest opponents to that was some of the small school superintendents that didn't want to lose their job. And
that hasn't changed.
yeah, and should have, but
Yeah.
Jankel's idea was squeeze them,
Right.
and they'll have to. Well, leading a horse to water, but sometimes he won't drink very well. But,
No, that's slow going. All right, well, I want to talk a little bit about Governor Mickelson's death,
okay,
kind of some of the events around that, if you're willing to do that.
I am.
So that was just 30 years ago here this last
Yes,
week.
19th of April.
And you were in Pier that day at the Capitol, I think.
Yeah, I was.
Can you talk a little bit about
I can, and will.
how that happened, and from your perspective, how you found out and what those couple days were like?
Yeah. Well, George on Friday before asked me, because I was leaving in 10 days, and Dean Krugman was going to replace me.
Right.
And I had a ranch that needed some attending to. And what little personality I had going into the job, I think I had probably lost and was losing. But anyway, it was time. And what we had, the balls in the air, the stuff was in place. And
You just had one session left.
it just had one session left. And
Right.
and George was, he was wanting to get his fingers into stuff that, one thing I learned, Tony, was the most valuable asset you have in state government is the governor's time.
Right.
And everybody wants to take too much of it, and your job is to kind of help regulate it. And he let me do that. And so we had a good marriage, I thought, on that issue. But Friday, he calls me in, Friday, and he said, well, what's Raleigh got in mind for this trip going on to Cincinnati? I said, well, I don't know. He told me that they have got all the key people in line down there, that because John Morrell and company was talking about getting out of town. And one of Mickelson's big worries was John Morrell would close on his watch.
Yeah.
And he had worked there as a kid, I think. And,
Oh, really?
yeah, you know, in
Yeah.
college or high school. So it was a big issue for him. And so I answered and said, that's all I know about it, because that was my project with Raleigh before I had decided, just before the start of the session, that I was going to leave after the session. So Sunday afternoon, I'm driving kind of around up by the Capitol. Here Raleigh's coming out of his office, and he's a Lyman County kid, almost like a younger brother, great friend. And so we talked for an hour or so, and he told me who the parties were, and one of which was Ron Reed.
Yeah.
And he had this office. He had $250,000, Raleigh said, and we want some of that money to help fund the program they're going to entice them with. And he mentioned Angus, who was the power guy, and good
Anson,
friend,
Angus
Anson.
Yep.
I didn't know Dave Birkeland, and of course Roger Ainge I'd met
Yep.
through different areas. And then of course Raleigh and Reed were both friends and the pilots. So anyway, they had gone, left, and as usual, Barb Reed, Ron's wife, was George's scheduler, and she and I, this was about 4:45, 4:30, I was going over the next day's agenda, and the governor's office, and then Barb had a desk and an office right outside of my little office, and
Were you in that little office just right outside the governor's office?
Yeah.
That's where you were the whole time?
no, after I stayed with Walt, he promised I could go down to the big office, the
Oh, okay.
operations.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I had that big office for a while
You
too. That's
did?
a lot better deal.
I was getting tired. That was one of the reasons I wanted out of there, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we're sitting there going through the agenda, and it was about, 20 to 5. And Mickey Miller, who was our receptionist, came blasting through the door between the receptionist, which was right up. You know, my office had two doors, one into the governor's and one out there. Said, you got to take this phone call. And Barb is sitting right across the table from me. And I did, and I identified myself. And this guy said he's with the Federal Aviation Authority. He said, your plane has crashed, is down. I want to know the tail numbers. Well, and I said, Barb, what's the tail numbers on the airplane? She did. And he said, I want to know who is all on it, the agenda. And, I hadn't gone through that. I knew someone. So she gave him, and then he said, do you have dental records for them? Said they're all burned beyond recognition. And Mickey was still standing there. Of course, I was answering questions, and by that time, Barbara, I'm sure, knowing her husband and her boss, both on her, I said, Mickey, get her out of here.
Yeah.
And so Barb by that time knew that plane was down, people dead. So she got out, and of course, this guy said, you have about 15 minutes to start notifying people, because the Chicago TV stations have starting to get wind of this, and it'll hit the news. And I don't know.
It was kind of late in the afternoon, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, 5 o'clock. See.
Yeah.
Yeah, 5 o'clock news coming on, and so Barb left Janie and some of the other staff took Barb, and I told Mickey to get a hold of Miller, get him back here, and I don't know, and to call the cabinet people, start letting them know, and then I started getting on the phone to try to. Well, first of all, Linda was driving by herself in Lincoln from Sioux Falls back.
They'd been up in Ponset, hadn't they?
No,
Or at the cabin?
George had been up there with Krugman the day
Oh.
before when they
Okay.
flew out of there that morning, picked him up.
Okay.
And but
then-
Linda was in Sioux Falls, and maybe she had taken George to the cabinet and then went to Sioux Falls. But she was coming back from Sioux Falls anyway, Tony, by herself.
Driving
they-
yourself.
Yeah, driving herself. And she might have been at the cabinet the day before, I don't know. Well, and we kind of knew what time she had left, so the issue was, how the heck can we catch her? Well, that was one issue. Second issue, I thought, well, gotta let the Mickelson family know, George. So I tried to call Tom Adam. Well, he was getting a haircut someplace, didn't know where. So I called Pat
Right.
at home, and I said, Pat, are you sitting down? No, I said, well, sit down. I got bad news. Told her what happened and didn't sugarcoat anything. And said, you got very little time to start calling your siblings. And then
Pat was George's sister.
Pat is George's sister. And Pat and Tom are very much part of our administration, you
Yes.
know. And she helped pick the people in the boards and commissions and stuff, and had a veto right on some stuff, not all.
Yeah.
But anyway, then I called Roland Dolly's father. Of course, the Reeds, she had already known, and the pilot's people, you know, our other pilot out we had three. I mean, he was taking care of those notifications. I called the highway patrol head. He came over to help try to flag Linda down en route back, and I think we got her stopped around Chamberlain. They pulled her over, and I don't know if we left the car down there, and she rode with them up, but so Pat and Tom, by the time she got here, were over at the governor's mansion. Lane Dolly, my wife, and Pam Roberts, I had tasked to go chase her down someplace. She was, I think, working for us at that time. Dave Birkeland's wife called in. She had started to hear stuff, and the poor lady was home alone. I talked to her and had one of the staffers call a neighbor to go over and be with her. Angus Anson's wife, who I had known fairly well, she called, told her, you know, what happened and the process. By that time, Walt had gotten there, I think, and then calls had started to come in. Of course, Martha was busy trying to chase Lane down, and our son, who was senior in high school, was home, and I know Carol Campbell, different governors' acquaintances had started to call.
Carol Campbell was South Carolina, right?
South Carolina, and he was vice chair of the nation. He was chair of the National Governors Association, and Roy Romer was chair of the Western Governors Association.
Colorado.
Colorado, both of which were friends.
Yep.
And North Dakota guy was a very close friend. We called him to let him know this events going on. And then, you know, what to do and how to do it. And so I arranged I said I want a cabinet meeting at 7:30 tomorrow morning, and a cabinet and senior staff. And John Thune was working for,
Was he the Republican Party director at that
He
time?
was, I think,
Or was he with the
I
railroad?
think he was at the Railroad Authority at that time, Tony.
Okay.
But we had always included him on staff meetings when he was the executive director of the party. So, and then Walt and I visited Lane and visited the pilots' wives. I don't think we went back over to see Barb Reed in town. And then Martha came back to the office about midnight, and then she and I stopped to see Pat and Tom as the last people I visited. And that's when then I became emotionally involved after that. It was the first time you had time to even think about yourself. I mean, there was jobs to do. And at the cabinet meeting, I had decided then the next morning, I got up early, couldn't sleep, and went down to the causeway, walked for half an hour and stuff to arrange my thoughts for the next morning. And I decided I needed two people to head, one to head up the conversion of power from George to Walt, and Jim Hill was my nominee for that. And then who's going to take care of the event and the formal stuff. And of course, one of our very best cabinet people was Robbie Roberts, a retired colonel and good.
Diener, wasn't he?
What?
Diener? Wasn't that
Yeah,
his department?
right,
Yeah.
absolutely right. And that next morning, and we had invited Zelmer, the new pastor at Lutheran Church, to come over and
Yes.
be with us. And I told him I kind of took charge, and I said, and whoever else you need of different cabinet people to decide that, turn them loose to do their jobs, and setting a program up. You know, Campbell and Shelley, I think, White Eagle, if that's his name, I think that might have been Shelley's idea. He was the Indian vocalist from
Oh, yeah.
Todd County, and then Bob Dole and
Right.
Dwight Adam were friends. When in '88, Dwight was a big Dole guy, as was Tom and Pat.
For president.
For president. George ended up supporting Dole, and we paid for that for a while into the Bush administration. But and Dole was someplace, and could he come? Well, don't know. But Campbell and Roy Romer, of course, were the presidents, and they got
And Bob Dole did come to the funeral.
Bob
didn't he?
Dole and spoke.
Yeah.
And I remember, it was kind of an add-on, and my introductions to him was a great American, and he was, and
Yes, he was.
remains.
I remember watching that.
Yeah. And but Robbie, with me, helped put together the program and the sequence of
Yes.
stuff. And
I've read all those plans. The governor's office has that file and
yeah.
keeps it on standby.
Yeah, and apparently National Governors Association
Yeah.
has used it as a backup.
Right.
Missouri candidate went down, was
Car-
killed.
Mel Carnahan.
Yeah,
Yes.
and they called me about what to do, what not to do, and how to.
Yeah.
So it's what I didn't know I made up. But
Right.
anyway, but worst day of my life, Tony, and but I think we did him proud. And and then Linda wanted me to, after the program, and the casket was taken down the front steps, and she said, "Well, are you going to go?" And I said, "No, my job's here, to make sure everything flows through somebody." Well, it was good, because about halfway over to Highmore someplace, she called and said they forgot to gas up the Lincoln. So I called Jones, the head of the highway patrol, and I said, you got to make a pit stop someplace, put gas in Lincoln. I think they did it in Miller. But anyway, apparently lined up all across were farmers with their trucks and stuff. A very emotional and memorable event. And then I flew over, Martha and I and my kids, the next morning to Brookings for the funeral. I was a pallbearer with Krugman and Bostic and Tom Graham and Tom Adam and Rich Helsper, I think.
They've been a law partner.
Yeah. But, on that night when we were, and Walt said, Frank, you have to stay with me. I need you.
Right.
And I said, okay. But every day after that, for the rest of that 16, 17 months was a struggle. He did let me move down into that bigger office.
Yeah.
And Jeannie Beeman, who was kind of my go-to, she went down with me and handled my scheduling and stuff. And then, of course, get into this, but Jankel called him in about a week and told him he was going to run for governor.
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. I mean...
Well, kind of moving on then into the
Miller
administration. Yeah. Like you said, Walt was governor for less than 2 years, but had a very eventful tenure.
Oh, yeah.
Between the spring flooding and the prison riot.
And
the video lottery gets shut down.
Yeah.
And then all the while running against Janklow.
Yeah.
Before we get done here, I'd like to hear a little about that.
Okay. You want to take a break?
Yeah, if you want to take a quick break.
I'll run